Spending bill signed by U.S. President Barack Obama. Last week, Moscow calls the move allowing the supply of surface-to-air missiles to Syrian opposition groups a hostile step. For more of this, I'm joined now in the studio by Murad Gizdiev. So, Murad, do tell us, what exactly is Russia concerned about here?
Well, it's just a little bit of backstory for you first. The new NDAA, the defense budget bill for 2017, is almost 3,000 pages long, costing taxpayers more than $600 billion. Now, if you spent a few weeks going through the pages, through the 3,000 pages, you'll stumble on section 1224, which somewhat sneakily authorizes the United States to send MANPADS to Syrian rebels, Islamists, whatever your bias, whatever you want to call them. MANPADS, shoulder-launched anti-aircraft missiles, good against helicopters, against low-flying jets and passenger liners. Of course, Russia, whose air forces working in Syria, is pretty concerned.
Washington committed to separate the rebels from the terrorists, but didn't cope with the task. So how is it possible to arm those people if you don't even know who will be on the receiving end, terrorists or so-called moderates? Today you'll supply moderates with MANPADS. Tomorrow they will defect to the extremists. That has happened in the past.
So, reason for concern number one. Despite spending years and hundreds of millions of dollars, the United States was unable to find and train more than a handful of moderate rebels. They're just not there in Syria. Reason number two, all the more moderate, as one might call them, groups are under the thumb, under the fist of more extremist, more hardline, jihadist groups, such as Nusra in Al-Qaeda in Syria. They're the strongest Syrian rebel group, and they have a tendency to bully all the others. Now, reason number three, the United States itself has admitted that, in a war zone, you can't predict anything. These weapons have fallen in the wrong hands before, and they might do so again. In fact, look at ISIS. They're driving around in US-made Humvees. They're firing US-made M4, M16 assault rifles. They've even got more advanced vehicles like the MRAP. They even showed off Abrams tanks and Bradleys. They have artillery pieces, weapons left behind by the United States in Iraq, which ISIS managed to seize, or seize from other rebel groups. And this is war. I've seen this in every war zone I've been to. If something can go wrong, it will go wrong. And when you send MANPADS, shoulder-launched anti-aircraft missiles, to dubious groups, there's a lot that can go wrong. Though it's fair to say that, this bill, as it's written, this section 1224, it says there must be strong justification for the supply of any such systems to the Syrian rebels. They need to know who the recipient is, where they are, their affiliation with jihadists, and what purpose those weapons are being sent there for.
Well, certainly some worrying developments there, Murad. Thanks for bringing us this update. Murad Gizdiev talking to me in the studio. And to discuss this further, I'm now joined by Mohammad Marandi, a professor at the University of Tehran. Mr. Marandi, thanks so much for joining us. So what is your position on the U.S. supplying rebels with MANPADS? Do you share the Russian spokesperson's concerns?
Well, I think that it's quite obvious, the perception among Iranians and the people in Syria that I've spoken to, I'm in Damascus at the moment, is that the Americans are intentionally giving these weapons, and they know that it will be passed on, that they will be passed on to the extremists. The Americans only give weapons to so-called moderates so that later on, when some tragic event occurs, they can claim that they were not responsible. But the belief is that, as with the sophisticated weapons that in the past have been given to the extremists, in this case the Americans also are doing this intentionally.
Well, after the recent meeting in Moscow between the foreign ministers of Russia, Iran, Turkey on Syria, there's been speculation that the U.S. is being sidelined on the Syrian front. What's your thought on this? To what extent do you agree or disagree with that?
Well, during the last few days I've been in Aleppo, and I just returned to Damascus last night. People in that area are very skeptical about Turkish intentions. And there's a great deal of anger directed towards Turkey. Yesterday on campus, when I spoke to colleagues and students there, it was universal. They believe that the Turkish president simply cannot be trusted. And therefore, they're waiting to see what happens. But their expectations for a negotiated settlement at this stage are not very high.
Well, you've recently visited the city of Aleppo that was liberated by Russian-Syrian forces. Can you share with us your impressions? Tell us a bit more about what you saw there.
Well, I visited different parts of the city, and one of the interesting things was that I spoke to a large number of refugees who came out of East Aleppo. And they were telling me that the extremists were preventing them from leaving, and they only were able to begin escaping at night and as the extremists were on the retreat in different fronts. And they would be shot at. Some of them told me that they actually saw people being killed. I also spoke to an Iranian soldier who was helping the refugees come out, and he said one of them said that her mother was shot, and they tried to rescue the mother, but the extremists, their snipers, were firing, and they couldn't help the mother. So it was a very tragic situation. And the Iranians, for example, were for the last month they've been giving 3 meals a day to up to 60,000 people who had escaped the extremists. But this is not something that I've heard even once in Western media outlets. The numbers have decreased now because many of them have returned to their homes, or they've gone to families in Western Aleppo and relatives or in the countryside. But everyone who I spoke to said that the extremists, they would receive aid, but they wouldn't distribute it to ordinary people. They would distribute it basically to their own families.
All right, Saeed Mohammad Marandi, a professor at the University of Tehran, thanks so much for talking to us and sharing your thoughts on this.